Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places. In a world where strength is measured by muscles and medals, where young warriors believe their training makes them invincible, there exists a truth that only experience can teach. Picture this: a crowded military supply tent buzzing with the energy of elite soldiers, the air thick with confidence and competition. These aren't ordinary men, they're Navy SEALs, the cream of military excellence, each one a walking testament to human endurance and skill.
They've conquered impossible obstacles, survived the world's most grueling training, and earned the right to wear one of the most respected uniforms in military history. But on this particular day, in this unremarkable supply tent, one of these warriors would learn that true strength isn't always what you think it is.
He would discover that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from a drill sergeant or a commanding officer, but from a quiet old man who seems completely out of place among these titans of warfare. What happened next would silence an entire tent full of America's most elite soldiers and change one young SEAL's understanding of what it really means to be strong. This is the story of a joke that backfired, a lesson that cut deep, and a moment of truth that proves sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't physical at all. The question that would shake everyone to their core was simple, yet devastating.
And the man who asked it, well, we looked like the least likely person in that tent to teach a Navy SEAL anything about strength, courage, or sacrifice.
This is what happened when cockiness met wisdom, when youth encountered experience, and when a single answer changed everything. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson stood at 6 feet 2 inches of pure military precision, his desert camouflage uniform crisp despite the Afghan heat that seemed to melt everything else around him. At 26, he had already accomplished more than most men would in a lifetime. His chest bore the trident pin that marked him as one of America's most elite warriors. A Navy SEAL who had earned his place through months of hell that broke grown men into sobbing children. The forward operating base buzzed with its usual afternoon activity as Marcus made his way toward the supply tent. Dust kicked up from passing vehicles, coating everything in a fine layer of desert grit that had become as familiar as breathing. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the ever-present aroma of military meals and the metallic tang of weapons oil. It was the smell of war, and Marcus had grown to love it. His teammates called him Tank, not just because of his impressive physique, but because of his ability to power through any obstacle. During SEAL training, he had carried wounded teammates on his back for miles without complaint.
He had held his breath underwater until his lungs screamed for mercy. He had endured hypothermia, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture that was designed to break the human spirit.
And through it all, Marcus had not just survived, he had thrived. The other SEALs in his unit looked up to him, and Marcus knew it.
He was the guy they called when they needed someone to kick down a door, the one who could carry the heaviest equipment without breaking a sweat. His shooting scores were legendary, his physical fitness tests were off the charts, and his mission success rate was perfect.
In every measurable way, Marcus Thompson was the ideal Navy SEAL. As he entered the supply tent, the familiar sounds of military banter filled the air. Soldiers from various units were picking up gear, trading stories, and engaging in the kind of good-natured competition that helped them cope with the stress of deployment. The tent was spacious but crowded, with metal shelving units stretching from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from ammunition to medical supplies to personal care items. Marcus spotted his target immediately: Corporal Jake Williams, a fellow SEAL who had been bragging all week about his performance in their last training exercise. Jake was younger than Marcus, maybe 23. With the kind of eager enthusiasm that reminded Marcus of himself when he had first earned his trident. The kid was good, no doubt about it, but Marcus felt it was his responsibility as the more experienced operator to keep Jake humble. "Hey, Williams," Marcus called out, his voice carrying that particular tone that every soldier recognized, the sound of incoming friendly fire. "I heard you think you're pretty tough after last week's exercise." Jake turned around, grinning. He was used to this kind of ribbing from Marcus, and he actually enjoyed it. The competition between SEALs was fierce but respectful, and both men knew that pushing each other made them better operators. "I don't think I'm tough, Sergeant," Jake replied, emphasizing Marcus's rank with mock formality. "I know I am." The other soldiers in the tent began to take notice. There was something magnetic about watching SEALs compete with each other, even if it was just verbal sparring. These were men who had proven themselves in ways that most people couldn't even imagine, and their confidence was infectious. Marcus stepped closer, his presence commanding attention without him having to say a word. "Is that right?" "Well, I've got a challenge for you, hotshot. Think you can handle it?" Jake's eyes lit up. "Bring it on." "All right then," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for everyone in the tent to hear. I want you to find the weakest person in this tent and arm wrestle them.
Should be easy enough for a tough guy like you, right?
The challenge seemed simple enough, almost ridiculously so. Jake looked around the tent, scanning the faces of the assembled soldiers.
There were Army infantrymen, Marines, Air Force personnel, and even a few Navy support staff. Most of them were young, fit, and capable, as you'd expect from military personnel deployed to a combat zone. But Marcus's challenge was specifically about finding the weakest person, and Jake took it seriously. His eyes eventually settled on a figure sitting quietly in the corner of the tent, almost hidden behind a stack of supply crates. It was an old man, probably in his 70s, wearing civilian clothes that had seen better days. His hair was completely white, thinning on top, and his face was deeply lined with wrinkles that spoke of decades of hard living. He was small in stature, maybe 5'6", and probably weighing no more than 140 pounds soaking wet. Jake had noticed the old man before, but hadn't paid much attention to him. Civilian contractors were common on military bases, usually specialists brought in for specific technical tasks or local nationals hired for various support roles. This particular old man seemed to blend into the background, never drawing attention to himself, never speaking unless spoken to. He appeared to be organizing some paperwork, his movements slow and deliberate. "That guy," Jake said, pointing toward the corner. "That's got to be the weakest person here." Marcus followed Jake's gaze and nodded approvingly. The old man did indeed appear to be the most physically unimposing person in the tent. "Perfect choice. Go ahead, ask him if he wants to arm wrestle."
Should be over in about 2 seconds.
The suggestion drew chuckles from the other soldiers who had been listening to the exchange.
The idea of a Navy SEAL arm wrestling an elderly civilian seemed absurd, but that was exactly what made it funny. It was the kind of harmless joke that helped break the tension of deployment life. Jake strutted over to where the old man was sitting, his confidence radiating from every step. The old man looked up as Jake approached, his eyes calm and patient. There was something about his demeanor that was hard to read, not fearful or intimidated, just quietly observant. "Excuse me, sir," Jake said, his tone respectful but clearly amused by the situation. "I know this might sound crazy, but would you be interested in an arm wrestling match? It's just for fun, nothing serious." The old man set down his paperwork and studied Jake for a long moment. His expression didn't change. No surprise, no offense, no amusement. Just a steady, thoughtful gaze that seemed to take in much more than Jake's physical appearance. "You want to arm wrestle me?" the old man asked, his voice quiet but clear. There was no accent that Jake could identify, just the careful pronunciation of someone who chose his words deliberately. "Yes, sir," Jake replied, maintaining his respectful tone despite the absurdity of the situation. "My friend over there," he gestured toward Marcus, "challenged me to find the weakest person in this tent and arm wrestle them. No offense intended, but you seemed like the obvious choice." The old man's eyes shifted to Marcus, then back to Jake. For a moment, Jake thought he might decline the challenge, which would have been perfectly reasonable. After all, why would an elderly civilian want to arm wrestle a Navy SEAL? But then the old man smiled. Not a mocking smile, or an angry smile, but something that looked almost sad. "I see," he said quietly, "and you believe I'm the weakest person here." "Well?" Jake said, suddenly feeling a bit uncomfortable with the directness of the question. "I mean, no disrespect, sir, but yeah, I think that's pretty obvious." The old man nodded slowly, as if he was considering something important. "Very well," he said finally. "I'll arm wrestle you. But first, let me ask you a question." Jake wasn't expecting this. Usually when someone accepted an arm wrestling challenge, they just found a table and got to it. Sure. What's your question?" The old man stood up slowly, his movements betraying his age, but also revealing a surprising steadiness. Despite his small stature, there was something about the way he carried himself that commanded attention. The conversation had been getting louder, and other soldiers in the tent were starting to gather around to see what was happening. Marcus pushed through the small crowd, grinning broadly. This was playing out exactly as he had hoped. "What's the holdup, Williams?" "Is the old man trying to back out?" "No," the old man said, his voice carrying further than Jake would have expected. "I'm not backing out. I just want to ask your friend here a simple question before we begin." The tent had grown quieter now, with more and more soldiers pausing their activities to watch the unusual scene unfold. Word was spreading that a Navy SEAL was about to arm wrestle an elderly civilian, and nobody wanted to miss the show. Marcus stepped forward, his chest puffed out with confidence. "Ask away, old-timer." But make it quick. I think we all know how this is going to end. The old man turned his attention to Marcus, those calm eyes focusing on him with an intensity that was somehow unsettling. Since you seem to be the one orchestrating this challenge, perhaps you're the right person to answer my question. He was enjoying being the center of attention, basking in the anticipation of watching his teammate easily defeat this frail old man. The old man was silent for several long seconds, as if he was carefully choosing his words. The entire tent seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to hear what question could possibly be important enough to delay what everyone assumed would be the world's shortest arm wrestling match. When the old man finally spoke, his voice was steady and clear, but there was something in it that made several soldiers unconsciously straighten up. It wasn't authority exactly, but something deeper, the weight of experience perhaps, or the quiet confidence that comes from having seen things that most people never would. Before we determine who is strongest, the old man said, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face, I think it would be fair to first determine who is weakest. So my question for you, young man, is this. How many men have you killed? The question hit the tent like a physical force, sucking all the oxygen out of the air and leaving behind a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. Around him, conversations died mid-sentence, supply requisitions were forgotten, and every eye in the tent focused on the small old man who had just asked the one question that no soldier ever wanted to answer directly.
Marcus felt his confident smile falter and then disappear entirely. His mouth opened and closed once, like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The question wasn't unfair, wasn't even unexpected in a military context. SEALs were warriors, after all, and warriors sometimes had to take lives. It was part of the job, part of what they trained for, part of what they accepted when they pinned on that trident.
But there was something about the way the old man had asked it, something about the timing and the context that made Marcus feel like he had just been stripped naked in front of his peers. This wasn't a debrief with his commanding officer or a conversation with a military psychologist.
This was supposed to be a joke, a harmless bit of fun to break up the monotony of deployment life. How had it turned into this?
Jake Williams stood frozen between Marcus and the old man, suddenly feeling like he was caught in the crossfire of something much bigger than an arm wrestling match. He could sense the shift in the tense atmosphere, the way the playful energy had been replaced by something heavier and more serious.
Other soldiers were looking uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. Marcus started, then stopped.
He had never been at a loss for words before. In every situation he had encountered during his military career, he had known exactly what to say and how to say it.
Confidence had always been his greatest weapon, the thing that separated him from lesser men. But now, faced with this simple question from this unremarkable old man, he found himself completely disarmed.
The old man waited patiently, his expression unchanged. There was no malice in his eyes, no judgment, just a quiet expectation that the question would be answered. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture straight despite his age, and Marcus got the strangest feeling that this man had asked difficult questions before and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for an honest response. Around them the tent remained silent. Marcus could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, waiting to see how the tough Navy SEAL would handle this unexpected challenge. Some of the younger soldiers looked confused, not understanding why the question had created such tension.
But the older veterans, the ones who had seen combat, understood immediately. They knew that this was no longer about arm wrestling or proving who was stronger.
This was about something much more fundamental. Marcus's mind raced, searching for the right response. He could lie, of course. He could make up a number or deflect the question with humor. He could get angry and demand to know what business it was of the old man's, but something about the way the old man was looking at him made dishonesty feel impossible. Those calm, patient eyes seemed to see right through any facade Marcus might try to construct. The truth was complicated. Marcus had been deployed 3 times to various combat zones. He had participated in numerous operations, some of which had resulted in enemy casualties. But kill counts weren't something that SEALs discussed casually, even among themselves. Each mission was different, each situation unique. Sometimes it was impossible to know exactly who had fired the fatal shot when multiple operators were engaged. Sometimes the darkness and chaos of night operations made precise accounting impossible.
More importantly, Marcus had discovered during his deployments that taking a life, even in the line of duty, was nothing like what he had expected. The movies and video games had never captured the weight of it, the way it settled into your chest and stayed there.
He remembered his first confirmed kill, a Taliban fighter who had been shooting at Marcus's team from a rooftop. The shot had been clean, professional, necessary.
The threat had been eliminated, and Marcus's teammates had been safe. By any measure, he had done his job perfectly.
But afterwards, alone in his bunk that night, Marcus had found himself thinking about the man he had killed.
Did he have a family? Children? Had he been fighting for what he believed was right just as Marcus was? These weren't useful thoughts for a soldier to have, and Marcus had learned to push them down, to focus on the mission and the protection of his teammates.
But they never went away completely. Marcus began again, his voice rough.
He cleared his throat and tried to project some of his usual confidence, but it felt forced now, artificial. It's not that simple.
Combat isn't like a video game where you get a score at the end. Sometimes you don't know if your shot was the one that... He trailed off, realizing that he was making excuses.
The old man continued to wait patiently, and Marcus found himself growing frustrated with his own inability to give a straight answer. Why was this so difficult?
He was a Navy SEAL, for crying out loud. He had trained for years to be mentally tough, to handle pressure, to maintain his composure in any situation.
But this wasn't like any situation he had trained for. This wasn't about physical courage or tactical expertise. This was about looking honestly at what he had done, what he had become, and what that meant about who he really was. Jake, still standing awkwardly between them, finally spoke up.
Look, sir, I don't think we need to get into all that. This was just supposed to be a friendly competition. Maybe we should just forget about the whole thing. The old man turned his attention to Jake, and for a moment his expression softened slightly. You're right, young man.
This was supposed to be about determining who was strongest and who was weakest. But I think that's exactly what we're doing, isn't it? The comment sent a ripple of understanding through the older soldiers in the tent.
They were beginning to see where this was heading, and it wasn't where any of them had expected when this whole thing started.
Marcus felt a flash of anger, partly at the old man for turning a simple joke into something serious, but mostly at himself for allowing it to happen. He was supposed to be in control here.
He was the Navy SEAL, the trained warrior, the man that others looked up to for leadership and strength. How had he let this elderly civilian turn the tables on him so completely?
Look,
Marcus said, his voice harder now. I don't know what game you're playing here, old man, but I've served my country with honor. I've done what needed to be done to protect my teammates and complete my missions.
If you're trying to make me feel bad about that, you're wasting your time.
The old man nodded slowly, as if Marcus had just confirmed something he already knew. I'm not trying to make you feel bad about anything, he said quietly. I'm simply trying to understand your definition of strength.
My definition of strength? Marcus repeated, his frustration growing. I can carry a wounded teammate 5 miles without stopping. I can hold my breath for 4 minutes underwater.
I can put 3 rounds in a target the size of a playing card from 300 yards. That's strength. Physical capabilities, the old man acknowledged. Certainly impressive.
But is that the only kind of strength that matters? Around them, the crowd of soldiers had grown larger. Word was spreading throughout the tent that something unusual was happening, and people were abandoning their tasks to witness what had become much more than an arm wrestling challenge.
Marcus could feel his confidence cracking under the weight of the old man's questions. This wasn't how things were supposed to go.
The old man was supposed to be intimidated by Marcus's reputation and accomplishments. He was supposed to decline the arm wrestling match, or lose quickly and gracefully, providing a moment of levity for everyone watching.
Instead, Marcus found himself being cross-examined by someone who seemed completely unimpressed by his military achievements. "What's your point?" Marcus asked, his voice betraying more defensiveness than he intended. "Are you saying that killing in combat makes someone weak? Because if that's your position, you can take it up with every military in the world."
Violence is sometimes necessary to protect innocent people. The old man remained calm in the face of Marcus's growing agitation.
I'm not making any judgments about the necessity of violence, he said. I'm asking you a simple question about numbers. How many men have you killed? It's a factual question, not a moral one. But Marcus knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing about this conversation was simple anymore.
The old man's question had forced him to confront something that he had been avoiding, something that all warriors eventually had to face: the weight of their actions, and what those actions said about who they really were. The tent had become so quiet that Marcus could hear the distant sound of helicopters landing on the base, the rumble of diesel generators, the everyday sounds of military life continuing outside this bubble of tension. But inside the tent, everything had stopped. Everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. waiting to see if the confident Navy SEAL would answer the old man's question or find a way to avoid it. Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some showed curiosity, others discomfort. A few of the younger soldiers looked confused, still not understanding why a simple question had created such drama. But the combat veterans understood. They knew that the old man had just asked Marcus to quantify something that couldn't really be quantified, to reduce the complexity of warfare to a simple number that would somehow define him as strong or weak. And in that moment, Marcus realized that he didn't know the answer. Not because he couldn't remember his missions or couldn't count his confirmed kills, but because he had never really thought about it in those terms. Each engagement had been unique, each decision made in the heat of the moment based on immediate tactical considerations. He had never sat down and added them up like a scorecard. More importantly, he realized that he didn't want to know the answer. He didn't want to reduce the complexity of his service, the weight of his decisions, the sacrifice of his targets, to a simple number that could be compared and judged. Some things were too important, too complicated, too human for that kind of reduction. But the old man was still waiting for an answer, and Marcus knew that his response would define not just how this confrontation ended, but how everyone in the tent would remember it. The joke had become a test, and Marcus wasn't sure he was passing. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. Marcus could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning that kept the supply tent relatively cool. His usual composure, the rock-solid confidence that had carried him through years of military service, was crumbling under the weight of a simple question from a man who looked like he couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag. Finally, Marcus made a decision. If this old man wanted to play games, if he wanted to turn a harmless joke into some kind of philosophical debate, then Marcus would meet him head-on. He straightened his shoulders, looked directly into the old man's calm eyes, and spoke with all the authority his rank and training could muster. "Fine," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You want a number? I've been deployed 3 times. I've participated in dozens of operations. I have 17 confirmed kills. 17 enemy combatants who were trying to harm American soldiers and innocent civilians. 17 people who chose to pick up weapons and fight against freedom and democracy." Is that what you wanted to hear? The number hung in the air like smoke. Marcus had never spoken it aloud before, had never even calculated it so precisely. But the old man's question had forced him to go through his deployments systematically, to count each engagement where he could definitively say that his bullet had ended a life. 17 sounded both smaller and larger than he had expected. Around the tent, soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked impressed despite themselves. 17 confirmed kills was a significant number for any operator. Others looked troubled, perhaps thinking about their own service records, their own nights spent staring at ceilings and wondering about the people they had killed. But all of them were focused on the old man, waiting to see how he would respond to Marcus's challenge. The old man nodded slowly, as if Marcus had just given him a piece of information that he found interesting but not surprising. 17, he repeated quietly. That's quite a few. Marcus felt a surge of vindication. The old man's calm acknowledgement felt like validation, proof that Marcus had successfully answered the challenge and demonstrated his warrior credentials.
"Yes, it is," Marcus replied, some of his confidence returning.
Each one justified, each one necessary to protect my teammates and complete the mission. That's what strength looks like in the real world. But the old man wasn't finished. "And how many men have you saved?" he asked, his voice still quiet but somehow carrying to every corner of the tent. The question caught Marcus off guard. It wasn't what he had expected as a follow-up, and he found himself struggling to understand what the old man was getting at. "Saved? Yes," the old man said patiently. "You've told me about the lives you've taken. I'm curious about the lives you've preserved. How many people are alive today because of your actions?" Marcus's mind raced. This wasn't a question that military after-action reports typically addressed. Mission success was usually measured in terms of objectives completed, intelligence gathered, or threats eliminated. The number of lives saved was much harder to quantify, much more abstract and difficult to prove. But as Marcus thought about it, images began flashing through his mind. The village in Afghanistan where his team had eliminated a Taliban cell that had been terrorizing the local population. The hostage rescue mission in Iraq, where they had freed 3 aid workers who would certainly have been executed.
The intelligence operation that had prevented a planned attack on a school. How many lives had those missions saved?
Dozens? Hundreds? There was no way to know for certain. Marcus began, then stopped. He realized that he had never really thought about his service in those terms. The focus had always been on the mission, on eliminating threats, on proving his capabilities as a warrior.
The lives saved had been an abstract concept, a justification for the violence rather than a concrete accomplishment to be proud of. "It's harder to count, isn't it?" the old man said. And for the first time there was something that might have been sympathy in his voice.
Much easier to count the dead than the living. Jake Williams, who had been standing frozen throughout this exchange, finally found his voice. "Sir, I think maybe we should just call this whole thing off. This was supposed to be fun, and it's gotten way too serious." The old man turned his attention to Jake, and Marcus was surprised to see genuine kindness in his expression. "You're right, young man. This has become quite serious."
But sometimes the most important conversations start as jokes. He looked back at Marcus, and something in his demeanor had shifted slightly.
The patient waiting was still there, but now there was something else, a weariness that seemed to come from deep inside, as if he was carrying a weight that had been with him for a very long time. "You asked me to arm wrestle you because you believed I was the weakest person in this tent," the old man said.
"And perhaps by some measures I am. I'm certainly the oldest. Probably the smallest. Definitely the least physically capable." Marcus felt a flicker of his earlier confidence returning. This seemed like an acknowledgement that his original assessment had been correct. "Right," he said. "No offense intended, sir, but that's just the objective reality." The old man smiled again, that same sad smile Marcus had noticed earlier. "None taken. But before we test your theory about my weakness, perhaps I should tell you a bit about myself. After all, it's only fair that you know who you're challenging." The crowd around them had grown even larger. Someone had apparently word to other parts of the base, because Marcus could see soldiers from different units pushing their way into the tent. The atmosphere had taken on the feeling of a major event, something that people would talk about for months afterward. "My name is Robert Chen," the old man said, his voice carrying easily despite its quiet tone. "I'm 73 years old, and I've been working as a translator and cultural advisor for the military for the past 8 years. Before that, I was retired for 22 years, living quietly with my wife in a small town in California, tending my garden and reading books." Marcus found himself genuinely curious despite his frustration. There was something about the way Robert spoke that suggested his story was far from over. "And before that?" Marcus asked. Robert's expression grew distant, as if he was looking back across decades to a different person entirely. "Before that, I was a soldier. Like you, actually. I spent 30 years in the Army, starting as an enlisted man and eventually retiring as a colonel. D-sit, vow for, bid." The revelation sent a murmur through the crowd. Marcus felt his assumptions beginning to shift. A retired Army colonel wasn't exactly what he had expected when he looked at this quiet old man organizing paperwork in the corner of a supply tent. 30 years, Marcus repeated. "That's quite a career." "It was," Robert agreed. "I served in Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, the First Gulf War, and several other smaller conflicts that most people have forgotten about. I commanded infantry units, led special operations teams, and spent more time in combat zones than I care to remember." With each word, Marcus felt his earlier confidence deflating further. This wasn't just any old man. This was a veteran warrior, someone who had been fighting battles before Marcus was even born. The physical frailty that Marcus had been so quick to judge suddenly seemed much less relevant. But Robert wasn't finished with his story. "During those 30 years, I had occasion to take lives in combat. Quite a few lives, actually. More than 17, I'm afraid." The tent had become completely silent again. Even the background noise from outside seemed to have faded away. Marcus stared at Robert, trying to reconcile this new information with his mental image of a weak old man who would be easy to defeat in an arm wrestling match. "How many?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he really wanted to know the answer. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the walls of the tent. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard him clearly. "I stopped counting after 50, he said. "That was in Vietnam, during my second tour. I was 25 years old, about your age now, and I thought that keeping track made me tough. I thought it proved how good I was at my job." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach.
50 confirmed kills by age 25, and Robert had served for 25 more years after that. The numbers were staggering, beyond anything Marcus had imagined.
But you know what I learned during all those years of counting? Robert continued, his eyes coming back to focus on Marcus. I learned that the number of people you kill doesn't measure your strength as a warrior.
It measures your exposure to circumstances where killing was necessary. And those circumstances, they change you.
Robert's hands, which had been clasped behind his back, came forward and rested at his sides. For the first time, Marcus noticed that they were shaking slightly, not with fear or nervousness, but with something else.
Age, perhaps, or the accumulated weight of decades of memories. After Vietnam, I stopped counting kills and started counting something else, Robert said. I started counting the soldiers who came home alive because of decisions I made. I counted the civilians who were protected by missions I planned. I counted the young men and women under my command who survived their deployments and went home to their families. Marcus found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn in despite his earlier antagonism. There was something hypnotic about Robert's quiet voice, something compelling about the story he was telling. And do you know what I discovered? Robert asked. The second number was always much larger than the first. For every life I took, there were dozens that were preserved. That's when I began to understand what real strength looked like. The old man paused, and Marcus realized that everyone in the tent was hanging on his every word. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was a lesson, a masterclass in leadership and warfare, from someone who had earned the right to teach it through decades of experience. So when you ask me about arm wrestling, Robert said, looking directly at Marcus, and when you assume that I'm the weakest person in this tent, I have to wonder, are we measuring the same kind of strength? Marcus felt as though the ground beneath his feet had shifted, leaving him struggling to maintain his balance in a world that suddenly looked very different from the one he thought he knew.
Standing before him wasn't the frail old man he had dismissed so easily just minutes before, but a warrior whose experience dwarfed his own, whose understanding of strength and weakness had been forged in conflicts that Marcus had only read about in history books. The tent around them had become something like a church, filled with the reverent silence of people who recognized they were witnessing something profound.
Even the youngest soldiers, the ones who had initially looked confused by the seriousness of the conversation, now seemed to understand that they were receiving an education that couldn't be found in any manual or training course. Robert Chen stood quietly, allowing his words to sink in, allowing Marcus time to process what he had just learned. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction in having turned the tables on the cocky young SEAL. Instead, there was something that looked almost like sadness, as if he regretted the necessity of this lesson, but understood its importance. Marcus's mind was reeling. Everything he thought he knew about strength, about what it meant to be a warrior, about his own place in the military hierarchy, was being challenged by this soft-spoken man who looked like he should be retired somewhere, tending a garden and reading books to his grandchildren. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice hoarse with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. I apologize. I had no idea about your service record." If I had known, Robert raised a gentle hand, stopping Marcus mid-sentence. If you had known, what? That I was a fellow soldier? That I had combat experience? Would that have changed your assessment of my physical strength? The question forced Marcus to confront an uncomfortable truth. Robert was still 73 years old.
He was still small in stature and obviously not in the same physical condition as a young Navy SEAL. None of that had changed with the revelation of his military background.
"No," Marcus admitted reluctantly. "You're still, physically speaking. Physically speaking, I am exactly what you first thought I was," Robert agreed. "I probably couldn't do 10 push-ups without stopping. I certainly couldn't keep up with you on a 5-mile run. In terms of raw physical capability, you are unquestionably stronger than I am." Marcus felt a flicker of confusion. If Robert was admitting to physical weakness, then what was the point of this entire conversation? What was the lesson he was supposed to be learning? Robert seemed to sense his confusion. "Tell me, Sergeant Thompson, what do you think makes a strong leader?" The question caught Marcus off guard. They had been talking about arm wrestling and kill counts, about physical strength and military service. Where did leadership fit into this equation? "Leadership," Marcus repeated, buying himself time to think. "I guess the ability to make tough decisions under pressure, setting an example for your subordinates, being someone that people can count on when things get difficult." "Good answers," Robert said. "All true as far as they go. But let me ask you something more specific. If you were leading a mission and you had to choose between 2 courses of action,
One that would eliminate 10 enemy fighters but put 3 of your own men at risk, and another that would eliminate only 5 enemy fighters but guarantee that all your men came home safely. Which would you choose? Marcus considered the question carefully. It was the kind of tactical scenario that came up in training exercises, the kind of decision that officers had to make in real combat situations. I'd choose the option that brought my men home, he said without hesitation. Mission objectives are important, but protecting your people is the first responsibility of any leader. Robert nodded approvingly.
A good answer. The kind of answer that comes from someone who understands that true strength isn't about how much damage you can inflict, but about how much damage you can prevent. The connection clicked in Marcus's mind like a puzzle piece falling into place. This wasn't just about physical strength or even combat effectiveness.
This was about a fundamental understanding of what it meant to be a protector versus what it meant to be a destroyer. During my 30 years of service, Robert continued, I learned that the strongest leaders weren't the ones who could kill the most enemies, or lift the heaviest weights, or run the fastest miles. They were the ones who could carry the emotional weight of command, who could make impossible decisions and live with the consequences, who could send young men and women into danger while taking full responsibility for their safety. Around them, the crowd of soldiers was listening with rapt attention. Many of them were young, early in their military careers, still forming their understanding of what service meant and what kind of soldiers they wanted to become. Robert's words were offering them a different perspective, a different way of thinking about strength and leadership that challenged everything they had been taught. Marcus found himself thinking about his own leadership experiences.
He had led teams in combat, made tactical decisions under fire, been responsible for the safety and success of other SEALs. But he realized now that he had always focused on the technical aspects of leadership, the planning, the coordination, the execution of operations.
He had never really considered the emotional weight of command, the burden of being responsible for other people's lives. I remember a mission in Vietnam, Robert said, his voice taking on the distant quality of someone recalling events from long ago. I was a captain then, commanding a company of infantry. We were tasked with clearing a village that intelligence said was being used as a staging area by the Viet Cong.
Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite himself. Around the tent, other soldiers were doing the same, creating an intimate circle of listeners around the old man who had become, without anyone quite realizing how, the center of everyone's attention.
When we arrived at the village, we found that the intelligence was wrong. There were no enemy fighters, just civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men.
But my orders were clear. Clear the village and deny it to the enemy. According to the book, that meant relocating the civilians and destroying any structures that could provide shelter or supplies to enemy forces. Robert paused, his eyes distant. Marcus could see that this was a memory that still affected him even after all these years. The civilians were terrified, Robert continued. They didn't understand why American soldiers were forcing them to leave their homes. They had nowhere else to go, no other source of shelter or food. Some of them were too old or sick to travel. But my orders were clear. Marcus waited, sensing that this story was building to something important, something that would help him understand the lesson Robert was trying to teach. I had a choice to make, Robert said. I could follow my orders exactly as written, relocate the civilians regardless of their circumstances, and destroy their village. Or I could find another way to complete the mission that didn't cause unnecessary suffering. What did you choose? Marcus asked, though something in Robert's expression suggested he already knew the answer. I chose to think beyond the immediate tactical situation, Robert replied. I spent time talking to the village elders, learning about their situation, understanding why they were in that location and what alternatives they might have. I discovered that they were refugees themselves, displaced from their original homes by earlier fighting. They had built this village as a temporary shelter but had nowhere else to go. Marcus was beginning to see where this was heading, but he remained silent, allowing Robert to finish his story. So instead of simply following orders, I contacted my superiors and proposed an alternative. We would help the civilians relocate to a refugee camp where they would have proper food, shelter, and medical care. We would destroy only those structures that could genuinely be used by enemy forces, leaving the rest intact in case the civilians ever had the opportunity to return, and we would establish a monitoring post nearby to ensure that enemy forces didn't move into the area later. Did your superiors approve the alternative? Jake Williams asked. He had been silent throughout most of the conversation, but the story had drawn him in as well. They did, Robert said, but more importantly,
It worked. The civilians were relocated safely and actually ended up in better conditions than they had been before. The village was denied to enemy forces without causing unnecessary destruction.
And my soldiers learned something valuable about the difference between following orders blindly and thinking critically about how to achieve the mission's actual objectives. Marcus felt something shifting inside him, a realization that went beyond anything he had expected when he walked into the supply tent that afternoon.
The strength wasn't in having the power to destroy the village, he said, slowly working through the lesson as he spoke. It was in having the wisdom to find a better solution. Robert smiled, and this time it wasn't the sad smile Marcus had noticed earlier. This was the smile of a teacher watching a student grasp a difficult concept. Exactly. Physical strength is about what you can do. True strength is about what you choose to do, especially when you have other options. The tent remained silent for several long moments as everyone absorbed this lesson. Marcus found himself thinking about his own missions, his own decisions, his own understanding of what it meant to be strong. How many times had he chosen the most direct, most forceful solution to a problem simply because he had the capability to do so? How many times had he failed to consider alternatives that might have achieved the same objectives with less collateral damage? But that's just one story, Robert continued. The real lesson came over years of command, through hundreds of decisions both large and small. Every time I chose protection over destruction, every time I found a way to achieve the mission without unnecessary violence, every time I brought my soldiers home safely, those were the moments when I felt truly strong. Marcus looked around the tent at the faces of his fellow soldiers. He could see that Robert's words were affecting all of them in different ways. Some looked thoughtful, others seemed troubled, and a few appeared to be having the same kind of fundamental reassessment that Marcus was experiencing.
So, when you challenge me to arm wrestle, Robert said, bringing the conversation back to where it had started, when you assume that I'm weak because I'm old and small, you're measuring strength by the wrong standard. You're looking at what I can do to you instead of what I can do for you.
The statement hung in the air like a challenge, but not the kind of challenge Marcus had been expecting when this whole thing began. This wasn't about proving physical dominance or tactical superiority.
This was about understanding the difference between power and strength, between force and leadership, between being feared and being respected. And Marcus was beginning to realize that by those measures, he might not be as strong as he had always believed.
The transformation that had taken place in the supply tent was palpable. What had begun as a simple joke between teammates had evolved into something profound, a masterclass in leadership and wisdom that would be remembered and discussed for years to come.
Marcus Thompson, the confident Navy SEAL who had walked into the tent thinking he understood what strength meant, now found himself fundamentally questioning everything he thought he knew about power, leadership, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. Robert Chen stood quietly in the center of the circle that had formed around him, no longer the inconspicuous old man organizing paperwork in the corner. The revelation of his military background and his patient explanation of true strength had transformed him in the eyes of everyone present, from a weak civilian into a respected elder, a mentor whose words carried the weight of decades of experience and hard-won wisdom. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all the eyes focused on him. The tent was filled with soldiers from various units and ranks, all waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. Would the young SEAL continue to insist on the arm wrestling match? Would he find a way to save face while acknowledging the lesson he had received? Or would he have the courage to admit that his initial assessment had been completely wrong? "Sir," Marcus began, his voice steadier now than it had been since this whole encounter began. "I owe you an apology, not just for the disrespect I showed when I suggested you were weak, but for the narrow way I was thinking about strength itself." Robert nodded slightly, his expression encouraging Marcus to continue. There was no judgment in his eyes, no desire to humiliate or embarrass the young soldier. Instead, there was the patient understanding of someone who remembered what it was like to be young, and certain of things that weren't as simple as they seemed. "When I looked at you," Marcus continued, "all I saw was physical limitations. I saw someone who couldn't keep up with me in combat, who couldn't carry heavy equipment, who couldn't physically dominate an opponent. I thought that made you weak." Around the tent, other soldiers were nodding slightly. Many of them had made similar assumptions, had engaged in the same kind of superficial assessment that Marcus was now acknowledging. His honesty was giving them permission to examine their own prejudices and misconceptions. "But I realize now that I was measuring strength by completely the wrong standard," Marcus said. I was focused on what you couldn't do instead of what you could do.
I was thinking about force instead of wisdom, about dominance instead of leadership. Robert's expression remained neutral, but Marcus could sense approval in his stillness. The old man was allowing Marcus to work through this realization on his own, to come to his own understanding of the lesson rather than having it imposed upon him. Marcus looked around the tent at his fellow soldiers. Many of them were young, like him, early in their military careers and still forming their understanding of what service meant. Others were more experienced, veterans of multiple deployments who had learned some of these lessons the hard way.
All of them were listening intently, recognizing that this moment held lessons that went far beyond the specific interaction between Marcus and Robert. You asked me how many men I had killed, Marcus said, turning back to face Robert directly. And I told you 17, like it was some kind of achievement, some proof of my worth as a warrior. But you've shown me that the real question isn't how many lives I've taken. It's how many lives I've protected, how many people are safe because of the choices I've made.
Jake Williams, who had been standing silently throughout most of this exchange, finally spoke up. But Marcus, you have protected people.
All of us have. That's what we're here for.
Marcus turned to his teammate, grateful for the support but understanding now that the issue was more complex than Jake realized. That's true, Marcus agreed.
But the point isn't whether we've protected people. It's how we think about our role as protectors versus our role as warriors. He paused, working through the implications of what he was saying. I've spent so much time focusing on being lethal, on being someone that enemies would fear, that I lost sight of what really matters.
It's not about how dangerous I am, it's about how much safety I can create for the people who depend on me. Robert spoke for the first time in several minutes, his voice quiet but carrying clearly throughout the tent.
The strongest leaders I'd known, he said, were the ones who could have caused tremendous destruction, but chose instead to find solutions that preserved life and achieved objectives without unnecessary violence. Marcus felt a flash of understanding, a connection between Robert's words and his own experiences. He thought about missions where he had been quick to choose the most aggressive approach, times when he might have achieved the same objectives with less violence if he had taken the time to consider alternatives.
There was a mission in Iraq, Marcus said slowly, the memory coming back to him with new clarity. We were tasked with capturing a high-value target who was hiding in a compound in a crowded neighborhood.
My initial plan was a direct assault, fast, overwhelming force to minimize the chance of the target escaping. The other soldiers in the tent leaned in closer, interested to hear how Marcus would apply Robert's lesson to his own experience. But our intelligence officer suggested a different approach, Marcus continued. She had been monitoring the target's patterns and noticed that he left the compound every few days to visit a market. Her plan was to wait and capture him during one of these trips, when he would be away from his security and away from the civilians in the compound. Marcus paused, remembering his initial reaction to the suggestion. I almost rejected her plan because it seemed less impressive, less like something the elite warrior would do. I wanted the dramatic assault, the chance to demonstrate our capabilities. What did you decide? Robert asked, though his tone suggested he suspected what the answer would be. I listened to her, Marcus admitted. We waited 3 days, and when the target went to the market, we captured him without a single shot being fired. No civilians were harmed, no property was damaged, and we accomplished the mission objective perfectly.
Around the tent, several soldiers nodded in recognition. Most of them had been in similar situations, faced with choices between aggressive and subtle approaches to achieving their objectives.
That intelligence officer, Marcus said, looking directly at Robert. She was demonstrating the same kind of strength you've been talking about. She had the wisdom to find a solution that achieved our goals without unnecessary violence.
And I almost ignored her input because it didn't fit my idea of what a warrior should do. Robert smiled, and Marcus could see genuine pride in his expression. Learning to listen to good advice, regardless of where it comes from, is one of the most important skills any leader can develop. Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, a sense of clarity that he hadn't experienced in years. The conversation had forced him to examine not just his assumptions about Robert, but his assumptions about himself, about his role as a soldier, about what it meant to be strong and effective.
Sir, Marcus said, straightening up and looking Robert directly in the eyes, I would still be honored to arm wrestle you if you're still willing. Not because I think you're weak, and not to prove that I'm strong, but because I'd like to show my respect for a fellow warrior, and because I think I've learned something important from this conversation. Robert considered the request for a moment, his expression thoughtful.
Around them, the tent had fallen silent again, everyone waiting to see how this remarkable encounter would finally resolve. "Very well," Robert said finally. "But let's be clear about what we're testing. This won't prove who is stronger overall. It will only prove who has more muscle mass in their arms and shoulders. And I think we both know how that contest will end." Marcus grinned, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Yes, sir, I think we do." Someone quickly arranged a small table and 2 chairs, and Marcus and Robert sat down across from each other. The crowd of soldiers pressed in closer, eager to witness the conclusion of this unprecedented encounter.
As they positioned their arms and gripped hands, Marcus looked into Robert's eyes and saw not an opponent to be defeated, but a mentor whose lessons would stay with him for the rest of his career. The actual arm wrestling match lasted exactly as long as everyone expected, about 3 seconds, with Robert's arm being gently but decisively pressed to the table.
But as the crowd cheered and laughed, as the tension that had filled the tent finally broke into celebration and relief, Marcus realized that the outcome of the arm wrestling match was completely irrelevant. The real contest had been about understanding, about wisdom, about learning to see beyond surface appearances to recognize true strength.
And in that contest, there was no question about who had won. As the crowd began to disperse and normal supply tent activities resumed, Marcus found himself shaking Robert's hand with genuine respect and gratitude.
"Thank you, sir," he said quietly, "for the lesson and for the way you taught it." Robert clasped Marcus's hand firmly, and for a moment the young SEAL could feel the strength that still existed in those aged fingers, not the strength to arm wrestle or carry heavy equipment, but the strength that comes from decades of making difficult decisions and living with their consequences.
"Remember," Robert said softly, "true strength isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you can do for others. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is choose not to use all the power you have." Marcus nodded, understanding now that this lesson would influence every decision he made for the rest of his military career and beyond.
He had entered the supply tent as a confident warrior who thought he understood what strength meant. He was leaving as a wiser leader who understood that real strength was about much more than physical capability or tactical superiority.
As he walked away from the tent, Marcus could hear other soldiers discussing what they had witnessed, trying to process the lessons they had learned from the quiet old man who had turned out to be anything but weak. The story would spread throughout the base and beyond, becoming the kind of legend that would be told and retold whenever young soldiers needed to understand the difference between being powerful and being strong. And Robert Chen, the 73-year-old translator who looked like the weakest man in the supply tent, had reminded an entire generation of warriors that true strength comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to protect, preserve, and lead with compassion even in the midst of conflict. The joke was over, but the lesson would last forever.
A Navy SEAL joked with the old man. One answer silenced the entire supply tent.